A lot of people are under the false impression that the release and disclosure of the UFO files is just a big distraction from the Epstein files, the Iran war, and everything else that's going on, but it is absolutely not a distraction. It is interwebbed and interconnected as one unified whole. There is a reason that Paulina Luna, as a member of Congress, is in charge of releasing the UFO files, the files on the JFK assassination, and the MKUltra files. Those are her three main priorities. Why do you think that is? It's because all three are interconnected. The technology from crash recoveries of UFO files and blaming a lot of MKUltra activities on UFOs is interconnected. The assassination of JFK links back to Howard Hughes and the development of using UFO crash recovery materials as a method for DARPA to understand telepathy and remote viewing in order to weaponize it and use it for mind control is all a part of the JFK files. And the way that they do all of that was implemented by MKUltra and members of MJ-12. It's all interconnected, it's not separate topics, and as disclosure is going to come out, all of this is going to tie together. And just yesterday, we found out that the CIA sent people into Tulsi Gabbard's office to actually seize the JFK files, to try and hide it all, to redact it all, to destroy those files. And Paulina Luna is now fighting to expose the people involved in that and to recover the files so that they can all come out.
CIA whistleblower testified that the U.S. intelligence covered up information that pointed to a lab leak. That's right. It wasn't bat soup that caused the whole world to lock down. It was the government and a reckless and experimental lab in Wuhan, China. So why would our own intelligence community cover up for China at the expense of American lives? Earlier today, I spoke with Florida Congresswoman Paulina Luna to see what she had to say. But first, she came to us with some pretty shocking breaking news. It's about files pertaining to the assassination of JFK and MKUltra, which was the CIA's human experimentation program. We have learned since our interview with Luna, the CIA marched into the National Reconnaissance Office warehouse in the middle of the night and took files under the jurisdiction of DNI Tulsi Gabbard. It was not a raid, and it did not happen today, but it did happen, and the files were not given back. Take a listen to my interview with Congresswoman Luna when we first heard the news. Before we get to the CIA whistleblower about the COVID-19 pandemic and Dr. Anthony Fauci's role in the cover-up, you also have some news coming out of the CIA that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so we were actually just notified that the CIA went in and took documents out of ODNI, multiple boxes pertaining to the JFK files as well as MKUltra. The reason why this is troubling is, A, there was an executive order that the president had directed the full declassification of JFK, but then also to the MKUltra files. The CIA famously has said that, you know, all documents were released and other documents had been destroyed. So these are allegedly those documents that apparently never existed, and so very troubling. I did just talk to Chairman Comer, and we are sending in the next hour or so a preservation of documents request to the CIA. I have calls into the White House to the director of the CIA himself, and so obviously as this develops, we'll keep everyone up to date, but strange times we're living in, that's for sure.
Does the CIA have jurisdiction to go into Gabbard's office like that and take documentation?
Well, the CIA does not have jurisdiction to work against an executive order by the president. And so the fact that someone did this when the president is out of country, from what I gather, I believe that Director Radcliffe is with him. And so this seems like it was an internal coup, to be honest.
Okay, well, we will certainly be watching that. Thank you for sharing. Also today, we saw testimony from a CIA whistleblower. Let's listen to what he had to say and get your response.
Public health policy would have been very different had the American public been made aware that a virus from a lab in China was going to serve as the foundation for an emergency use authorization mRNA products being mandated by the former administration.
So, Congresswoman, I'm grateful for the transparency. It's very difficult to come out as a whistleblower because you face consequences, retaliation, which we'll get to in just a second. But we've known for many years that Dr. Fauci indeed covered up the pandemic for obvious reasons. He was funding gain-of-function research illegally at the Wuhan lab. It got out of control. They Frankensteined a virus, and it ended up killing millions of people and shutting down the world and damaging future generations in terms of education. The consequences are very far-reaching. There's no new news on the front that Fauci covered this up, but he can't really face that many consequences because Joe Biden gave him a pardon.
I think what Dr. Fauci did was on the level of human rights abuses and violations, and there is still a question on whether or not Joe Biden physically signed that pardon. We know that on our investigations on House oversight, many of the pardons are exact or identical matches with signatures, meaning that it's not possible unless it's done by something called AutoPen. I think that that's something that Todd Blanche needs to bring charges on. He is the acting attorney general now, and that's something that he can do, or at least look at these pardons as null and void if they were not exactly signed by the president. To my knowledge, one of the few that are legitimate are the ones on Hunter Biden, but the other ones are called to question as whether or not they were actually authorized by the president himself. And so I think as we move forward and as this continues to come out, the American people know what happened, even people that not necessarily are conservative or Republican, see what happened with COVID-19, and it's a lesson that we can all learn from, but there are very real human rights abuses that Dr. Fauci committed, and he should be held accountable. He should be in jail.
And it's a shame that Democrats refused to show up to this hearing today to get to the bottom of what exactly happened, to hold people accountable for exactly the reasons you just laid out. But Erdman, who's a whistleblower, spoke today about retaliation within the CIA. This is what he said.
The analysts that supported the 2023 lab leak conclusion took every administrative measure available to them to address their deep concerns regarding the analytic integrity of their finished intelligence. CIA managers retaliated against them.
And we also know that bribes were offered from Fauci to scientists to change their opinions as well. But based on what you told me at the beginning of this conversation with the CIA and this testimony from the whistleblower today, it seems there's a major problem going on inside the agency with politicizing intelligence and making these decisions for political purposes rather than just following the intelligence and the facts where they may lead.
Oh, most certainly. Exactly what you just laid out is also known as the deep state, and there's a flush that needs to occur at the agency. I like Director Radcliffe. He's a great man. He's been doing a great job, but he is one man, and there needs to be massive instrumental changes and shakeups at the agency. I think the deputy director of the CIA needs to be backing Radcliffe up on those changes. But what I will tell you today, and just hearing what I heard about the overt efforts to undermine the president's executive order specifically pertaining to JFK, or I don't know, Congress's order to release and request the the MKUltra files, all of that should tell you everything you need to know about the agency, and that it still operates, so it seems, out of the purview and jurisdiction of the executive branch, of the congressional branch, and that is unacceptable, of the legislative branch, excuse me, and it's unacceptable. And so, as you saw, Comer is working on that subpoena with me. We will send it in the morning if we don't hear back from the CIA. But either which way, we will find out who went into Tulsi's office and took those files. If this person, and this is not a threat, this is going to happen. If those files are not returned within the next 24 hours, you will be called, your faces will be made public in front of the entire American people. All of Congress will see it, and we will hold you accountable for going against a direct executive order by the president and interfering with a congressional investigation. So return the files, do not destroy documents. You will get a preservation of documents notice for Congress, and any member of the CIA that engages in undermining this investigation will be held criminally accountable. And I'm also waiting for a call back from Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general. We are not playing games with you. Return the documents.
There is a connection between the paranormal, UFOs, and the myths of ancient history. The clues are scattered across the landscape from a forbidden past, maybe even in your own backyard. There is a connection between the true nature of our reality, consciousness, and the unexplained. I'm Carl the Crusher. Let's explore the unknown. How is the assassination of JFK interconnected with MKUltra and UFO disclosure? Well, it all actually goes back to this mysterious figure that we talked about in a previous video recently about Andrei Puharich. There's a whole documentary that just came out about Andrei Puharich that was featured on the Jesse Michaels podcast. And I did a video the other day that was about 3 hours long, and a lot of this information was sort of embedded in the last hour of that video. And I think a lot of people missed it and didn't get to see it because it was so later in the video and hard to get to after watching 2 hours of backstory. But let me just try to summarize it all for you. Andrei Puharich was one of the first guys who went down and he converted the MKUltra research from using psychedelic drugs in order to use mind control and manipulate people into confessing the things that they did during interrogations, for mind control, for implanting false memories, and for the use in the star camps for kids, or space camps for kids, where they were using kids and teenagers in order to try and communicate with UFOs. He was very interested in contacting aliens and interdimensional beings and what he called the Council of the Nine, using different techniques. And what he did was he transferred this ability of using psychedelic drugs over to using frequencies and technology. He started off by developing a company and forming some patents where they could implant devices into people's teeth, and then they could transmit messages into them, and they would hear voices and see shadow figures in the room, and all of it was simulated using computers and technology. And this goes clear back to the 1950s. That's how long that they were doing this. Andrei Puharich was the one that took Uri Geller, the remote viewer, to Stanford Research Institute in order to be tested. Now we're talking about Hal Puthoff and the formation of the Stanford Research Institute. There's a lot of rumors that Hal Puthoff was a member of MJ-12 and a member of the CIA. Now, part of the research that was being done at Stanford Research Institute involved Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée used to go to the Stanford Research Institute, and while interviewing remote viewers like Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Uri Geller, and other people like Hal Puthoff, and being friends with him, is how he initially came up with the ideas to develop ARPA, which was ARPANET. ARPANET was the very first innovation and development of what we know now as the internet, how we transfer signals across the web wirelessly all over the world and all throughout the country.
I really enjoyed our conversation last night. We all went out to dinner, and Hal Puthoff blew my mind.
As you know, I've known him for a long time.
Yeah, when did you meet him? What year?
I knew him at SRI. Actually, I was at Stanford Research Institute before him, in one of the very early internet research teams when there was no internet. It was called the ARPANET. It was a network of the Advanced Research Project Agency, and it was all, a computer experiment and so on. It turned into, we had engine number 3 on the internet at SRI in California.
Engine
so
number
it was
3
part
on
of
the ARPANET.
By the time I joined them, there were like 30 machines already. So, and it was exciting. And then, Dr. Puthoff and Russell Tarr came in with a proposal to SRI to do parapsychology research at SRI, which had never been done. And it was funny because so I was already there, in a team.
What year was this? What year?
Oh, God. 74.
Wow.
70.
So the ARPANET was around 74.
Yeah. And it was funny because I was in my office, and the vice president of SRI came in, closed the door, and said, Jacques, you've published some things that are controversial under your name on UFOs, and you haven't lost your scientific reputation, which is why you're here working for us at SRI. on the ARPANET. But there's a proposal from Dr. Puthoff and Dr. Tark to do parapsychology research here, and we've never done that. And I said, well, it's a very valid, I think it's a very valid area of research. We should, we're in the kind of institution that should do that.
Well, ARPA eventually became DARPA. If you go watch documentaries on the History Channel about DARPA and mind control techniques, you're going to see none other than Travis Taylor, one of the lead scientists at Skinwalker Ranch, popping up all the time. Hal Puthoff is also one of the lead scientists involved in studying UFO crash recovery material, or what they call metamaterials. These metamaterials are mostly made out of bismuth and magnesium and these super ultra refined metals and materials.
A Las Vegas operation hidden within Bigelow Aerospace. Documents first reported by the I-Team show that Bass landed a contract with the DIA, and one of the objectives was to study so-called metamaterials, as well as futuristic technologies.
It was a multi-layered bismuth and magnesium sample. Bismuth layers less than a human hair. Magnesium samples about 10 times the size of a human hair. Supposedly picked up in the crash retrieval of an advanced aerospace vehicle. Looks like it's been in a crash.
In Las Vegas back in June, physicist Hal Puthoff came pretty close to saying that this weird wedge of metamaterial came from a crashed saucer, but he can't know for sure. Puthoff and his colleague Dr. Eric Davis are on the cutting edge of attempts to identify an assortment of bits and pieces that are seemingly beyond anything we can create. This one sample is engineered in layers thinner than microns through a process unknown on Earth and for a purpose we can only guess.
Nowhere could we find any evidence that anybody ever made one of these. When we talked to people who in the materials field who should know, they said, we don't know why anybody would want to make anything like this.
Astrophysicist Dr. Jacques Vallée has been analyzing mystery metals since the 80s, often using the technical expertise of Stanford University and Silicon Valley to unravel unknown samples acquired from all over the world. Vallée pointedly steers clear of any military funding, and he shared his findings at public conferences.
We have multiple samples now from multiple sources, ranging a wide variety of integrity.
These days, former intelligence officer Lou Elizondo helps to collect and protect unknown chunks for the To the Stars Academy. Before that, he ran ATIP, the Pentagon's secret UFO study, the same one which released the now famous videos. This summer, To the Stars launched ATOM, its own effort to find and study pieces of material that may have been stashed away for decades after being retrieved from the sites of close encounters.
And if you go back to Andrei Puharich, he believed and worked with and researched a guy who was picking up radio frequencies and false signals and was kind of losing his mind and going schizophrenic because he had all these really fine metal shavings that were getting into his bloodstream and in the gums of his mouth and in his teeth from working at a metal fabrication factory.
I think there's a story with Puharich where some guy who works at a metal mill or something.
Yeah, that was his first aha moment, is that they got a mental patient, a guy who claimed he was hearing voices, but his family's convinced he's sane, and we're worried because they want to put him in a mental hospital, and we don't want that to happen. So, can you check him out? So they bring him in, they get to know him, and he says, okay, I work at this metal factory where I guess it basically is grinding metal pieces and this kind of thing. Annie Jacobson talks about it too in her book.
Puharich's theory was that this metal dust had somehow collected on his teeth and in essence acted like a radio antenna.
We found out he was tuned to station WOR in New York.
And they put the mental patient in their Faraday cage, which blocks out all electronic signals. And the mental patient suddenly is no longer hearing voices, is like perfectly sane.
And sure enough, as soon as we locked the door, the sound ceased. Open the door, the sound would come on.
That's pretty remarkable of Puharich to think that all through and to test it in the laboratory.
And that kicked off like all of this research where it said, okay, well, if that's possible, like what else is possible with that basic idea that that's, real.
Yeah, and if you can bypass the ear canal with vibration, whatever is processing the audio ultimately in the brain, we know that you can turn molecular mass into frequency. Everything has a quote unquote resonant frequency.
Yeah.
This sounds woo-woo, but what I just said is fact.
Yeah.
Could you then use some sort of electromagnetic, radio wave or some wave that connects directly to the brain? And that kind of gets into freaky territory because you end up in sort of psychic warfare, that's ubiquitous or whatever and widespread. Like it's kind of weird to think about.
This led to the idea that they could use fine metal powders, different implants, and different types of metal alloys in order to amplify telepathy. This is what MKUltra was using. They were using implants and metal materials in order to amplify people's receptibility to transmit signals into their mind in order to make them hallucinate, to think they were seeing ghosts, UFOs, and all kinds of weird stuff. People that they were experimenting on in these space camps for kids literally thought that they were channeling and talking to aliens and receiving messages from UFOs. A big part of UFO disclosure is the UFO crash recovery program. And one of the things that they claim is that the UFOs are piloted by the entities inside the craft using psychic abilities and telepathy. Their consciousness actually interfaces with the metal of the craft, and they actually fly the UFOs using their mind. So you would have to think that the study of this UFO metamaterial would help leap MKUltra forward in the use of different exotic materials or metamaterials and reverse engineering alien technology in order to understand, like, if aliens can pilot their craft using telepathy, then that means that they're using consciousness to transfer signals back and forth in between the body of the entity and the craft itself so that they can fly them without having to use any analog controls. If they could develop these metamaterials and embed them into people, then basically you could use mind control or control those people just like you're flying or driving a drone or a remote control car. You can embed these chips inside people or use fine metal powders and material or possible metamaterials in order to do this.
Michael Herrera, he's a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. He served from June 2007 to October 2011 and did a tour primarily in Southeast Asia. Thank you, Michael.
All right, good afternoon. I just want to start out this statement saying that I'm willing to testify under oath with penalty of perjury in a public hearing from Congress, in front of Congress. I've asked for this repeatedly and still waiting. So I am a former United States infantryman with 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. It was the most decorated infantry battalion in the Marine Corps. And at that point, we essentially, the job as infantry, you can imagine it's humanitarian assistance, but it's also direct action through combat. So I wanted to do an exciting job, and that was exciting. So the context with this is we were called out to Southeast Asia, which is where our theater of operations were. That is the western part of Sumatra. There was a 7.6 magnitude earthquake that has struck, and that was around September 30th of 2009. We then were the only ship, which was the USS Denver at that time, that routed from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, which was attached to the 7th Naval Fleet. Then we were the only ship that was cast from there to go to the western part of Sumatra. Now, upon arriving there, my team, which was randomized, it wasn't like a set team because we were doing different things in the ship, and we were essentially put into sticks. Those sticks were then boarded onto CH-53 Super Stallions, which is a transport helicopter. They're pretty big. They're one of my favorite transport helicopters that the Marine Corps has. And that's what we inserted into. Our job at that time was to provide security for the landing zones or hasty landing zones, which you'll see as HLZs or LZs. And then we were also to facilitate and help with the aid that was being transferred to these landing sites. And we took these helicopters because some of the roads were washed out and we couldn't reach them outside of, obviously, getting helicopter inserted in was suitable. So for us, we're not going to stick out in the open. We're going to position ourselves tactically to where, one, we have the best observation possible, which is elevation. So we then decided to secure a ridgeline that was off to the side, about 150 meters or so, probably less than that. And upon looking over that ridgeline towards the north, we see the top of this thing, and it was rotating in a clockwise position. It was transforming colors between light matte gray and a dark matte black. Now, when you have something that's through vegetation like that, that's very abstract. It's going to get your attention. We thought it could have been a building. It could have been something like that. At that point, I had a camera that was on me that I was taking video of some of the helicopter insertions, or at least when we were getting off the ship. And I actually had some photos I snagged of this from the top view of where we were positioned on that ridgeline. Because we then saw that, the leader of our team decided that we had to go down and investigate. And so we proceeded. As soon as we got to this clearing, which is what this thing was basically occupying, and looking at the craft, you could see that it was octagonal shape. It had sharp edges, quarters. It had rivets. It had seams. You could tell it was pieced together and it was man-made. You could tell it was something that was built from one of these aerospace companies. Now, accompanying this craft, when we were verging onto the position, we were then intercepted by a team of 8 operators that were wearing black camouflage utilities that had no insignia, that had no marking, no rankings. Some of them, most of them were wearing ball caps, is what I can recall. They then searched us. They then seized our weapons. They cleared them. They took our magazines out of our pouches, dumped them, kicked them off. They kept a couple guys at standoff distance while we were searched. They took photos of our IDs, and they started to basically threaten us to say, hey, it's easy to get lost out here. You can get killed out here. You can lose you out here, things like that. And as that's going on, we were seeing these trucks come up, which look like that. They could either be Ford F-350s or they could be Toyota Tundras, up armored, and they were pulling these trailers. Now, these trailers were like a miniature version of a shipping container that had mini split HVAC systems on the top of that. Now, when I first saw this, I had speculated, even when I first came forward in 2023, I had speculated it was a drug running operation because of the HVAC systems. So these trucks were loading these containers, which were about 4 of them, onto the platform that's underneath this craft. Now, I only remember seeing 4 trucks. And as soon as we're going through being searched, the trucks then disappear. I think they may have went onto the backside. And that platform started to raise up. It then met with the main part of the craft right there. And as soon as it came together, it started, obviously, the rotation didn't change. There was an audible hum that you could only hear, which was like a guitar amp or an electrical transformer kind of noise. Not as identical, but if you guys can understand how they would sound, this is what it exactly sounded like. And as it met with that craft, it decided to raise up, and each of the corners of this craft started to basically show a color: red, yellow, green, and blue are the only lights I can remember seeing. As soon as it cleared the tree line, it shot over to the left of us, which is towards the ocean. And that thing, obviously, it did not destroy the trees, did not produce any kind of rotor wash, did not break the sound barrier. But this thing went from thousands of miles an hour, possibly hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, instantaneously like that, like a spark off a grinding wheel. And it shot over to the left. Upon that craft departing, they had told us to turn around and traverse back up the hill. So we did that, as they're still threatening us, wanting to shoot us, things like that. And as soon as we get back to the LZ, which we trucked up the hill, went down back to where we were at, we were then accompanied by a gunnery sergeant who I'd never seen before, who had a radio, and he called basically for us to get out of there. We were adjusting our gear because when they put our weapons back, they slung them on our back, basically buttstock here, and it'd be very hard to get them off of you. So we had to help each other before we decided to go back onto the ship. And we were briefed by a rear admiral subsequently after that. Now, my camera, they did not find in my dump pouch. Now, when we actually concluded this operation and proceeded to go on Liberty in Subic Bay in the Philippines, the first night on Liberty, I come back to the ship and I find my camera that I actually had stowed in my locker, which was secured, was on my rack. The memory card and the battery that was in it was missing. So I had then retrieved another battery out of my locker, put it in, and it wouldn't work. So that was what happened to that. Now, when we ended up going back to Camp Hansen in Okinawa, I was also met with a Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, at least that's who he presented himself as with his uniform, but he had no name tag on. I remember seeing silver jump wings and seeing obviously a slew of ribbons. But this is the gentleman that pulled us each aside separately, threatened us with execution because of treason, because of disclosing this information. The NDA that he forced us to sign, I remember having to put my social security number. It had TSSCI on it, and it had Indonesia is the only things I could recall. I signed it. Now, I want to make something very clear. These NDAs are not legal by any means. I have not had any kind of repercussions legally. This is the reason why I decided to testify to Arrow. This is the reason why I decided to testify to Senate Select Committee of Intelligence as well as Senate Armed Services. And I've yet to have any legal ramifications from doing so, which is why this is public. So if there's anybody out there who is worried about that, rest assured, as long as it's something that falls under this umbrella of unconstitutional and illegal, you're going to be fine. We can help you with that. So at the time, as I came forward in 2023, I was approached by a couple of senior operators that were out west of the United States. And they had provided a context to me with evidence, as well as showing me a few things going out there. But this was not for drugs. These were psionic assets that they were recruiting from Indonesia. Now, they'll say it's a psionic recruitment operation, but it's still human trafficking. Okay, they had humans that were in these containers. And the reason why they were doing this is because there is something about third world countries that have people that are more enlightened and more consciously adept, which is what they want. And what I mean by they are these illegal, unconstitutional legacy programs. Now, I also want to make another distinction between this, that a lot of the people in these programs are not evil people. They have been hoodwinked for decades until they find out that they're a part of something that could be monstrous and potentially criminal. In a lot of cases, it is. So since having that happen and providing that to me, and then to go back and tell people like him, as well as some people in the government that I'm working with, as well as federal law enforcement. So this is an ongoing problem. I'm not going to get into how I know this, but just understand it is an ongoing problem. The other ongoing problem too is obviously Arrow. When they had put out my testimony through volume 1 of the Arrow report that they released to Congress and the public, they completely misconstrued my testimony. They said that I saw an extraterrestrial spacecraft and I was intercepted by a team of U.S. special operators. First of all, I didn't know who these guys were. I didn't know what their backgrounds were until these operators that participated in similar operations, not exactly like this, but have knowledge of it, and then clued me into what they really, how they plucked them, what their testing was, how they get through this. So obviously that information has been handed over to federal law enforcement. If you guys can put the next slide, please. So this is an aftermath of obviously a downing of a non-human intelligent vehicle or ET vehicle that they were using some of these psionic operators, like you just heard from, out in some remote parts of certain areas of the United States, where they then are targeting collectively, and they are downing these extraterrestrial spacecraft with these EMP weapon systems, which you can see right here. If anybody's curious about what brand it is, it's called Epirus, and it's a Leonidas. That is what the systems are using. They use them for drone warfare, for deterrence. Well, for dual purpose. So the people that produce those more than likely have no idea that these are also being utilized in that faction of taking down ET vehicles and using psionic assets to lure them in and to do that. So this is the reason why we are bringing this up. This is the reason why I've testified, because after getting this information, providing evidence, seeing these things firsthand to an extent, There's a reason why I'm trying to get this solved as well. Because I could live with the fact that if they were actually drugs in those containers, that would have been fine. But then hearing that it's humans and it's a sonic recruitment operation, human trafficking, I feel like my duty is to help these people that are in these third world countries that are being smuggled here. And I'm going to continue to do so. And I'm going to assist it until we solve this problem. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, what does all this have to do with the JFK assassination, and why is Paulina Luna in charge of the UFO files, the JFK files, and also the MKUltra files? Well, a lot of the people that were involved in the JFK assassination were a team of assassins that were put together and hired by none other than Howard Hughes from Las Vegas, Nevada. Howard Hughes was one of the first tech billionaires, a lot like Elon Musk, and Howard Hughes got a lot of the original contracts in order to develop phased array and directed radar systems, and he was projecting these original signals and experiments onto the city of Las Vegas, seeing if they could conduct mind control. If the technology involved in mind control could be expanded into entire radar systems or satellite systems, where you could basically influence an entire city of people, then you could project those signals anywhere that you want, into anyone that you want, and you could control their dreams, their emotions, their own thoughts in their heads, all kinds of different stuff. And Howard Hughes was the first guy to get those contracts and start doing that kind of testing. It's basically large scale, community-wide or city-wide MKUltra operations. And the team that he formed to go assassinate Fidel Castro were the same team of assassins that ended up murdering and assassinating John F. Kennedy. And after the assassination, a lot of the people involved in that assassination, when they were interviewed and interrogated, acted like they didn't even remember anything, almost like their minds were erased.
We have to get back to this intellectron thing.
Yeah.
Like, so
Yeah.
is the implication
Yeah.
of this story that this company had something to do with the assassination of JFK? Or like, were these men in tweed suits raiding the office, the CIA, and were they thinking that Intellectron had something to do with this? Or
so Puharich, he leaves the round table, he moves to New York City, or he moves to Ossining. A lot of people know this in relation to Puharich because he lived there most of his life.
Upstate New York.
Yeah, it's an hour on the train north of the city. Mad Men, of course, the show.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't even realize all the characters, they all live in Ossining. Like Don, I guess I remember watching it, but there's some reference like they live in Ossining. So it's a very, wealthy area. And all of a sudden, Puharich has what's considered like a mansion there, basically, a huge house. He moves there. He tells his family that basically he just got this contract to study basically more of what was going on at the Round Table Foundation, but there were specific people who needed him to move to New York. So they moved there. I mean, his family life is a whole different thing. He had his wife sadly committed suicide around this time.
Really?
Yeah, he was very distraught about that. And
what happened?
I received a grim call from Jenny's father. Jenny had quietly leapt from the hospital roof into eternity. I wept for Jenny. I wept for my failure to keep her healthy and happy. I wept for our 3 daughters who would never know a normal upbringing. I cried out to God in crushing despair.
But so they moved to New York. He starts this company called Intellectron. He gets Annie Jacobson helped figure this out. He gets a grant for $300,000, which at the time would have been like at least $1 million or more, from the Atomic Energy Commission, which is strange. And we have all the documents that we found that prove that they went and visited him. They gave him this grant. So he starts this thing, Intellectron, which is basically labeled as a biomedical research company. So they have an office in Hell's Kitchen. And again, with Puharich, I have to stress, like, there was always these instances in his life, this one being the really the first, but it was sort of the round table too, where like all of a sudden he just has this company and this and these employees and this fund, all of a sudden it's just, kind of expensive to have a big office in New York City and all this stuff and all this state of the art at the time electronic equipment. And
well, it sounds like in classic intelligence world front sort of stuff.
Well,
how does Epstein have a huge hedge fund?
Oh yeah, he just always had, and it's always this company. And basically, this was early 60s, now 62, 63. This is when he starts the hearing experiments, where basically he claims that deaf people would come into the office and they would do research on them, and basically they designed a device which would enable deaf people to hear, basically by emitting a certain frequency that would somehow bypass like the normal way we hear and go directly to the hearing center in the brain. And it was this breakthrough medical discovery, which, go figure, goes completely quiet. No one ever hears about it.
Yeah.
Again, they kind of glazed over the space camp for kids topic a little bit. And I want to dig into that a little bit further and the connections. Now that they've talked about the JFK assassination and how all of that went down, there is a lot of evidence that has come out that the people that were involved directly in the JFK assassination were originally a team that was organized by none other than Howard Hughes.
Getting recruited, because at Bailey's office, and I actually found out what was going on in the Watergate burglary, which, by the way, was all about the Kennedy assassination. That's what it was.
Well, wait, can you help us understand that?
That's totally a long story.
Okay, and I don't.
I'll give you the brief.
Give me the brief, because I do want to. I want to dive into that Elizondo stuff, and I'd love to hear about that. But I would love to hear about this connection.
Okay, yeah. Bottom line, the reason that Richard Nixon ordered the White House plumbers, who were made up of 4 of Santos Traficante's gunmen, and the wiretapping specialists from the CIA, to go into the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, was because he was afraid that Larry O'Brien, who had just been made the new head of the Democratic National Committee, who had prior to that time for 20 years been the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes, the multi-billionaire. Yeah. It turns out that Howard Hughes, back in 1960, when Richard Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, as vice president, chaired the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council, running covert operations.
Yeah.
And it turns out that Howard Hughes was a CIA secret NSA consultant. Did the Glomar Explorer, built the Glomar Explorer to pick up Russian submarines.
Yep.
Did the big Spruce Goose that was the prototype for the C-5A transport. Did a lot of other major things for them, real top secret things. And so Richard Nixon is back in 1960, when he was vice president under Eisenhower. Now, the burglar is in 1972. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, because he's getting set to run for his second term, because he's won the 1968 election after Bobby was killed.
Right.
Right? And so he's getting set to do his second term. And so the burglary takes place on June 17th of 1972. He's running for his second term. Right? But the bottom line is, when he realized that what's his head had just become made head of the Democratic National Committee, Larry O'Brien, he said, holy shit. He's saying, wait a second, he was the chief lobbyist for Howard Hughes. He may know that I'm the one that actually called Howard Hughes and had Howard Hughes set up the assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. And it turns out those are the people that killed the president.
Wow.
And if it ever comes out that I, back in 1960, through Howard Hughes, set up the assassination team, which in fact killed the president.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever going to believe me that I didn't order that. And I'll lose the election. So that's why he sent them in.
When you're saying this is who killed Kennedy, you are saying it with some real authority. Yeah, but you're also saying it like everybody knows this, which I don't think everybody knows this.
No, but we got to interview Stravacanti, who's the one that set up the assassination team. That Howard Hughes got his lawyer, Bob Mayhew.
But who is hiring that team?
Howard Hughes, basically. Howard Hughes is because Richard Nixon asked him to put together an assassination team to kill Fidel Castro.
But no, I'm saying if these same people shot Kennedy.
Yes.
Who told them to shoot Kennedy?
Actually, it was Allen Dulles, who was the previous CIA director of the CIA.
What's the reasoning behind that? Why did they want to take him out?
Well, actually, the exact reason was that not after the Cuban Missile Crisis in April of '61, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis of October of 1962, that we had come so close to having a thermonuclear war at that time that both Khrushchev and John Kennedy were totally traumatized by what had happened. And so that they both, after the resolution, on the 19th of October of 1962, and they stood down, and Kennedy agreed that if Khrushchev would take the missiles out of Cuba, Kennedy would take the missiles out of Turkey that they had there. Bottom line is they settled that, and they avoided the thermonuclear war. But they'd come to within almost 2 minutes of having total nuclear exchange. Yeah. So the two of them were so traumatized. What they did is they opened up a completely secret line of communication with each other, that they were exchanging 18 different letters back and forth. There was a guy by the name of Norman Cousins that was running the letters back and forth between the two of them. And in the exchange of letters, John Kennedy, after the October missile crisis, going over into the beginning of 1963, that he and Khrushchev made an agreement that they were each going to exercise their respective authority as the chief executives of the U.S. and Russia to start ordering the disassembly of all the nuclear warheads.
Howard Hughes actually funded and organized a group of people, and this is even weirdly affiliated with the Mormon Church, because Howard Hughes, his main guy was that ran everything for him was a guy named Frank Gay, who was a Mormon, a member of the Mormon Church, and they ran a lot of Howard Hughes's operations through a network of Mormons that were nicknamed the Mormon Mafia, that purchased all of his land for him, did a lot of business deals for him, and provided a lot of cover from the public for Howard Hughes to do activities, obtain contracts, purchase land, and to stay anonymous. Howard Hughes actually was the one in charge of putting together an assassination team to go down and take care of or assassinate Fidel Castro. And when all of that didn't end up playing out according to plan, it was the same assassination team that allegedly went and handled the JFK assassination. And Howard Hughes is a billionaire, a philanthropist, this inventor that lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. And the way that, now, if you hang with me here, it gets connected and really strange, because Howard Hughes was one of the first guys to obtain a contract in the state of Nevada from the military and the government to do radar testing or phased array directed energy weapons testing. And initially he got in trouble because he was conducting tests on parts of Las Vegas itself. So he was directing the radar and doing like mind control and behavior experiments on the population of Las Vegas, Nevada, on the civilians and the people living there. And then they were told basically, okay, you can't do that. You can't do these experiments this wide open on civilians. And so he purchased over 70 pieces of property around Nevada and began conducting these experiments there as well. meaning that there was a property that you guys know if you watch this YouTube channel for a while that I went and researched called Mount Wilson, Nevada, which is about 80 miles north of Area 51. And one of the things in the history of that property was that Mount Wilson Ranch was originally owned by a guy named Benny Binion, who is from opened the Binion's Casino. He was a mafia guy, and there was loose affiliations between the mafia, Benny Binion's, the Mormon Church, the Mormon Mafia, and Howard Hughes.
Clark is dropping bombshells on us. He's making a phone call right now. What's his name, Doug?
Doug Shear.
Doug Shear. I didn't want to say the name wrong. Doug Shear, who we've talked to and interviewed before.
He's very popular. He's very into the history of Nevada. He's like one of the last old timers.
Yes.
He has so much. He's really a neat guy to talk to. You know, you talked to him in a brief interview.
Yes. And he's got a book with pictures and documentation.
I had to go next door, fucking Lemmings. I thought he was gonna die.
He's got
what's happening?
A book with Howard Hughes in it.
With his fucking heart.
Everybody up here is having heart attacks and brain problems and getting cancer.
Yeah, I just went over there and fucking just visited him, and he's like, I go, fuck, dude, you all right? He's all pale and shit.
Oh, shit.
So then we start talking about the Howard Hughes Company and how they had the first psychotronic directed energy system contracts. And all of the evidence says and rumors are that he was up here and he's the one that put in the runway.
Since he never left the Desert Inn, he needed a team of executive assistants and advisors to oversee his business dealings. This team was led by a man named Frank Gay, who was curiously known as Bill. Gay was a Mormon that Hughes had hired right out of UCLA.
And so it's very probable that Howard Hughes at some point owned the land at Mount Wilson, Nevada. This property at Mount Wilson, Nevada eventually became a research location that Robert Bigelow purchased, who is the owner of Skinwalker Ranch for about 8 years during the 1990s. And 2 weeks before he purchased the land in Utah that we know today as Skinwalker Ranch, Robert Bigelow also purchased this land called Mount Wilson, Nevada. And at Mount Wilson, Nevada, directly on his research team that went there was none other than Hal Puthoff, Dr. Hal Puthoff. So this connects not only through Howard Hughes, but also back to Hal Puthoff and Andrei Puharich, because we talked earlier about how Andrei Puharich introduced Uri Geller to Hal Puthoff, and that's how they started the Stanford Research Institute. Now all of a sudden we see Robert Bigelow, who mysteriously looks a lot like Howard Hughes, and a lot of people don't know exactly where he got his billions of dollars from. They say that it was from, he started a hotel chain or a budget motel chain and became really wealthy. But it's almost like Robert Bigelow looks very similar, has the same mustache, the same facial structure and everything as Howard Hughes. And there are rumors that Robert Bigelow is one of the illegitimate sons of Howard Hughes, and that when he was going to college and when he turned 21, that suddenly he inherited a large trust fund and all of the money from the assets of Howard Hughes. And so you see Robert Bigelow suddenly picking up where his father may have given him all the money and was involved in aerospace engineering and radar testing. And suddenly you see Robert Bigelow investing in properties like Skinwalker Ranch and Mount Wilson Ranch, and bringing on as his lead scientist none other than Hal Puthoff, who was involved with Andrei Puharich. And Hal Puthoff is direct colleagues with Eric Davis and several other people. And Jacques Vallée was also there at Mount Wilson, and they all went from Skinwalker Ranch to Mount Wilson Ranch. One of the interesting things about Mount Wilson Ranch is that after Robert Bigelow, before he purchased the property, if this was during a timeline when Howard Hughes may have secretly owned it through other people, at one point it was used as a Christian camp for kids. And so it makes you wonder if this idea of doing a space camp for kids was something that was always also being conducted at Mount Wilson Ranch in Nevada, where they would invite these kids up to go basically to a Christian camp, this outdoor camp for kids. And secretly, they weren't telling them that there was a bunch of mysterious electromagnetic field testing or mind control testing, or even that there was potentially a UFO hiding underground that they may have been using the kids to try and do telepathy or to communicate with it to find where this UFO was hiding underground.
Hughes preferred working with Mormons because he knew they didn't drink, smoke, or gamble. He thought this made them more likely to avoid being tempted by the vices of Vegas and handle his business with greater discretion and integrity. Hughes was so committed to using Mormons that they wound up composing the entirety of Gay's team.
According to the weather, we got maybe 2 hours before full blizzard, so we got to move fast. Okay.
Andy, Paul, and the team at Mount Wilson Ranch have one chance to try to blast their way into 2 abandoned mine entrances that might connect to an underground tunnel system, leading to what is rumored to be a buried UFO.
Mine 2 gave us a lot of pause because it looked like it was intentionally filled.
Okay.
And our question became, why would anyone take the time to fill a hole? If it was a non-productive mine,
you would just leave it.
And who filled it in?
Who and why?
Did Bigelow do it, or was it done 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago?
Right.
Now all of this, like I said, is at the mines themselves, but the same land mass actually flows down to something called a lower meadow. And then we took it to the magnetometer, and this is what our magnetometer showed us.
Oh, look at that.
This square area here, this is the lower meadow.
That's clearly artificial. That looks like a phased array.
Sure does.
Looks like a phased array antenna system built under the ground. You see where I'm going with this, Eric?
Mm-hmm.
We've heard rumors that certain low frequencies in that range could be used to not only detect UAPs, but possibly even take them down. But I never knew them to bury them. They were always on the surface.
Like a low frequency beam or something?
Well, just a phased array radar. The rumors that is actually radar that brought down the Roswell thing, assuming it was real. You know, I don't have any evidence one way or the other, but my point is that's just another one of the stories we've heard that kind of fits in the why Bigelow would have been interested.
Right.
But if Bigelow would have found that, he would have stayed.
The reports are also that Robert Bigelow himself has owned and ran space camps for kids, that he had one in Colorado. And the rumors are that he had this big cabin in Colorado where he would have a bunch of kids come out to space camp, that they all had to wear matching white shoes, and they were doing remote viewing and telepathy experiments, exactly like we hear about with Andrei Puharich and the experiments from the Stanford Research Institute with Hal Puthoff. So you can see the chain of events that goes all the way back to the Roswell crash, all the way back into the 1950s with Andrei Puharich, MKUltra, the Montauk experiments, UFO crash recovery programs, the Council of the Nine, psionic contact and operations using telepathy to communicate with interdimensional beings, and Uri Geller going from Andrei Puharich to Hal Puthoff, and then Robert Bigelow maybe inheriting all this money from Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was the guy that hired the team that ended up being the ones that were involved in the JFK assassination. People from the Council of the Nine working with Andrei Puharich were involved in housing people that were involved, that worked at the book suppository, that were involved in the assassination of JFK. And underlying all of this is this weird mystery of UFOs or aliens kind of pulling the strings or telling them what to do, manipulating the course of humanity as we go along, and them doing unethical potential experiments on kids to try and interface with this phenomena to see what's going on. It goes all the way up to Hal Puthoff being there at the Stanford Research Institute, being at Mount Wilson Ranch, doing work as the lead scientist for Skinwalker Ranch. All of this going on clear up into the 1990s. And so you can see how this is an intricate web that's very interesting, that sort of ties all of these characters all together. And the modern story that we have today, where you see Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis showing up on these documentaries like Age of Disclosure, you have this entire dark underbelly of mystery that involves the JFK assassination, that involves all of this weird weapons contracts and directed energy weapons, inventing mind control techniques where they're trying to remote control people. You have CIA or FBI showing up at Andrei Puharich's house right after the JFK assassination, almost like maybe accusing him of being involved in creating a sort of Manchurian candidate, or being involved in the stuff that was going on in the research, that in the formation of the team, because there was people involved in the JFK assassination that sweared up to their death that they had no memory of even playing a part in it. It's like their minds were erased, or they were mind controlled to be a part of that. Now, that could have just been a cover story that they were saying, but when you look at all the details, it all ties into MKUltra and mind control and manipulation, communication with aliens, or the Council of the Nine that are sort of manipulating and changing the course of humanity. And it goes from clear back in the early days when Andrei Puharich was studying magic mushrooms down in Mexico with shaman, and then they are learning how to build Faraday cages and direct frequencies directly into people's minds to make them see things and hear things and remote control them like a drone. And all of this kind of follows like a thread all the way up into Skinwalker Ranch into the 1990s. And so it really makes you wonder how much of this developed out into what we know today, because Jacques Vallée, who was there at Mount Wilson Ranch, who's been at Skinwalker Ranch, who's deeply embedded into ufology, he was one of the original inventors and innovators that built the internet. He was there and involved in talking with Ingo Swann, who was the lead psychic at the Stanford Research Institute doing remote viewing for Hal Puthoff. Jacques Vallée would go and sit with Ingo Swann and interview him and say, how do you communicate messages and do remote viewing? Does telepathy really work in the universe? How can we transmit messages over long distances and communicate without having a wire there, or wirelessly or whatever? And Jacques Vallée took these conversations that he had with Ingo Swann back to his work in the development of what they called ARPA. And ARPANET was the initial phase and invention of what we now call the internet. So the public, we got the internet that came from ARPANET, and ARPA eventually became DARPA.
There are those who believe that this same technology could also be used by DARPA as a new form of mind control. Like their counterparts at the CIA, DARPA-funded researchers have spent decades investigating how the human mind can be altered. In 1965, DARPA launched Project Pandora, which studied the possibility of using microwave radiation to control human behavior. The project reportedly ended in 1969, but DARPA's investigation of how machines can affect and possibly control the brain continues to this day.
There are explicit programs of DARPA to read and write to human brains, whether it's through direct implants within the brain or wearing some kind of cap. So these things are being worked on, and we know that.
So what's the next step? Maybe the next step is we can send instructions and information to an actual person from a distance with this kind of technology to let another person control their actions. But that could be something that could be malicious.
If there's some way to do it from a distance, a much greater distance than something that you can wear on your scalp, that would be the ultimate technological achievement that would fall into this realm of mind control and direct human-machine interface that DARPA may well want to keep secret.
But what about the other sample on the table? Those are pieces of bismuth.
A layered bismuth and magnesium sample. Bismuth layers less than a human hair. Magnesium samples about 10 times the size of a human hair. Supposedly picked up in the crash retrieval of an advanced aerospace vehicle. Looks like it's been in a crash.
In Las Vegas back in June, physicist Hal Puthoff came pretty close to saying that this weird wedge of metamaterial came from a crashed saucer, but he can't know for sure. Puthoff and his colleague, Dr. Eric Davis, are on the cutting edge of attempts to identify an assortment of bits and pieces that are seemingly beyond anything we can create. This one sample is engineered in layers thinner than microns through a process unknown on Earth and for a purpose we can only guess.
Nowhere could we find any evidence that anybody ever made one of these. When we talked to people who in the materials field who should know, they said, we don't know why anybody would want to make anything like this.
Astrophysicist Dr. Jacques Vallée has been analyzing mystery metals since the 80s, often using the technical expertise of Stanford University and Silicon Valley to unravel unknown samples acquired from all over the world. Vallée pointedly steers clear of any military funding, and he shared his findings at public conferences.
We have multiple samples now from multiple sources, ranging a wide variety of integrity.
These days, former intelligence officer Lou Elizondo helps to collect and protect unknown chunks for the To the Stars Academy. Before that, he ran ATIP, the Pentagon's secret UFO study, the same one which released the now famous videos. This summer, To the Stars launched ATOM, its own effort to find and study pieces of material that may have been stashed away for decades after being retrieved from the sites of close encounters. Elizondo says there are legitimate reasons why the military and now private groups are in a race to figure out these materials.
What our internal efforts are to potentially, I'm not saying we're doing this, maybe replicate that technology, or to reverse engineer that technology, right? Now you're getting into some sensitivities that you don't necessarily want everybody to be privy to.
Hal claims that they even have the properties to micro-size waveguides for terahertz frequencies.
It turns out that it reduces the size of the required microwave guide for terahertz frequencies down to about 1/30th of the wavelength, which is amazing. So it means you can basically put 30 waveguides in the volume of a single waveguide at terahertz frequencies.
Got it. Thanks a lot, Hal. Really appreciate it.
The group quickly became known around town as the Mormon Mafia. By the mid-1960s, Las Vegas was heavily influenced by people who were either members of or associated with various American mafias. While Mormon businessmen had been the ones to encourage the growth of the relatively shady gambling business, they were simultaneously concerned about what it was doing to the city's image. They eventually realized that the solution was to arrange for the mob-owned casinos to be purchased by someone with a more legitimate image, someone like Howard Hughes. Worried that if his involvement was generally known, he would get gouged on the purchase prices, Hughes' casino buying spree was ultimately enabled by E. Perry Thomas, who would pose as the buyer in Hughes' stead. His involvement remained a secret, and by the time that secret got out, the billionaire aviator already owned over a dozen properties in the town.
So do you know the original story of how it was kind of procured initially?
The story was that it was sent anonymously by someone claiming to be an Army officer.
Long story short, this Army officer was going through his grandfather's archives when he found this rare sample.
And then written in the diary was that it was a piece from Roswell.
The entire DARPA program where they are developing human interfaces and implants like Neuralink and things, where they're implanting microchips and things into the brain to try and remote control people or try to make paralyzed people be able to walk again. It's the entire weaponization of this, and it all revolves back around Jacques Vallée, Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis, and obviously Andrea Puharich as their predecessor. And so this whole intricate web has this dark side. So that's why I keep saying when the UFOs files come out, part of the reason why it might be difficult and the spooky side of what ufology all contains and what it's all about, it might be because of all of the secret unethical things and experiments that they were doing on civilians and potentially on kids that thought they were going to space camp, people that were visiting Mount Wilson Ranch, potentially security guards that were patrolling at Skinwalker Ranch. All could have been like guinea pigs where they were experimenting with these directed energy weapon type things in order to see if they could mind control them, make them think they were seeing UFOs or paranormal activity, or maybe they were actually trying to do both. You have to get the money from somewhere. And so even if you're looking for UFOs or if you're exploring the paranormal, your funding ultimately comes from people that want to use that information for weapons development, for government contracts, and for these contracted secret agencies. So the whole thing is layered in mystery. And I just wanted to make this whole video and talk about this topic and draw light and go into a little bit more depth with this interview on the Jesse Michaels podcast, because I think that a lot of people, like I said earlier, get into UFOs because UFOs are really fascinating. They're really cool. It's fun to go out and do psionics and look for them. But a lot of people just are not aware of the dark side, of the manipulative side, the MKUltra aspects to this, the human experimentation that actually is involved underneath the surface in some of these programs, and how a lot of these people who on the surface might have originally had good intentions, how their work and their research was ultimately used to develop mind control systems, remote control systems, to develop artificial intelligence, to create DARPA and all kinds of other things that are really spooky to think about.
But that's when he first starts this whole, radio frequency stuff, voices in the head kind of stuff, which again was under this, we're researching on deaf people, we're doing this, in a medical sense, we're helping people. But that's when these, men in suits show up. That's when, once again, he's getting contracts from Navy, CIA. Again, almost everyone that was involved at the round table was back in this Intellectron situation with him. And so that, I think the connection, I don't want to just jump to conclusions, but I think what I've often thought with this JFK thing and why to Melanie, his assistant, seemed like such a big deal is that it may have had some tie-in with a mind control, sort of like a Sirhan situation with Lee Harvey Oswald. I know that's like a pretty crazy, bold claim, but that's just what I've thought.
It's not
because
that,
they were doing that. We're talking, and again, this is something I don't think a lot of people know. And I think people don't realize a lot of that MKUltra stuff happened much earlier, but they were doing this work in 62, 63 of like basically sending messages to people
with Howard
heads,
Hughes as well.
And we have footage, it's real. The people from the Atomic Energy Commission write very clearly in letters we found, like we went, Annie Jacobson talks about it, I think, in her book, like one of the guys was like, I don't believe you, test me, and just, and did the test on himself and it worked. And then it goes dark and Intellectron closes and all of a sudden it's on to the next sort of, mysterious company.
Deep Black program or some other front company.
Yeah.
That's really, really trippy. Is there any explicit connection between Lee Harvey Oswald and Intellectron, or that sort of speculation on your part?
I haven't looked, but I just think, if you want to go there, it's like Lavenda says, the whole connection there at the round table, and then this weird incident where they seem to make a big deal about telling him about the assassination. At that exact time, that exact year, they're researching ways to be able to send messages to someone's mind to do something specific, Manchurian Candidate, et cetera, et cetera.
Apparently, Dulles did not want the fact that Ruth Paine had actually been at the summer house or whatever. I think that summer, right before JFK was assassinated, she did not want, that at all on record. I think Mary Bancroft started to talk about it, and he he kind of acted like he didn't know what was going on when, like, you know, he would have reacted earnestly if he hadn't. He clearly did know what was going on. And obviously, Dulles was probably, you know, among a very short list of people. If the intersection of capabilities, motivation to take out JFK, Dulles has to be on anybody's short list. And then to further kind of steelman there maybe being a there, we know that Jack Ruby was an MKUltra patient. I mean, like 95%, you know, like you have letters between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb, who's definitely the kind of architect of MKUltra, you know, and Jolly West was, you know, UCLA psychiatry, but clearly very involved in Operation Midnight Climax and maybe brainwashed Charles Manson. And he sees Jack Ruby, who never remembers killing Lee Harvey Oswald, in his jail cell alone, no cameras, comes out and says, Jack Ruby has had a psychiatric break. And then Jack Ruby, you know, who was fully lucid but just didn't remember having shot Lee Harvey Oswald, talks about Jews dying outside of his cell and just like literally cracks.
So even though this section of the video was something that I included previously in the video that was 3 hours long, talking about Andrija Puharich and how all of this happened, at the end of that video, the last hour of it, it connects everything back to Howard Hughes, MKUltra, and the mystery of how it involves UFOs, or how they blame a lot of the things that they do on the aliens. The UFO crash recovery program and analyzing that material is not just about trying to innovate anti-gravity technology. It's not just about free energy devices and propulsion, exotic propulsion that they could recover and understand from the crashed UFOs. Don't you think that if they realized that extraterrestrials were interfacing with these craft using psionics, using telepathy, using consciousness directly, that they would also want to understand that? It is a known thing that in most of the alien abduction stories, people are basically paralyzed in their rooms or in their bed, or during the incident, they are completely immobilized. They're mind controlled through telepathy by these entities, taken aboard the craft, and then allegedly experimented on in different ways. Don't you think if that was a known thing that the government was studying as part of the UFO crash recovery program, that they would also want to weaponize that? Like, holy smokes, if these extraterrestrial or interdimensional entities are able to literally paralyze people in their bed and then abduct them without them being able to do anything and project images and messages directly into their mind, that is all connected to MKUltra. And MKUltra goes all the way back to the innovations of Andrija Puharich, his connections to Hal Puthoff, and this whole idea of trying to understand telepathy and remote viewing and the innovation of secret technologies in order to implant false perceptions directly into people's minds. And then you've got the JFK assassination, and right after that happened, you had people from the CIA showing up at Andrija Puharich's office, questioning him about that, and there was like a whole incident involved in that, in his research, and you have to wonder if that was all connected. Then you've got Jacques Vallée, who is innovating the development of the internet, and ARPANET, and ARPA eventually becomes DARPA, and DARPA is deeply involved in trying to understand this whole idea of implanting chips into people's minds, using synthetics, using vaccinations as a part of mind control. Can you remote control a person like an RC car, or like you would fly a drone? Gary Nolan is one of the lead scientists who is working on studying these metamaterials from crashed UFOs from Roswell and other locations, but he's also well known and went on the Tucker Carlson show and talked about this phenomenon called interference syndrome, where people's brains are actually affected and given a disorder similar to Havana syndrome whenever they get close to a UFO. The original team that was set up by Howard Hughes to go and assassinate Fidel Castro down in Cuba was the same team of assassins that ended up assassinating John F. Kennedy. And it was Jacques Vallée that actually uncovered the secret CIA files saying that they were planning on parking a submarine off the coast of Cuba and doing the very first tests of Project Bluebeam, where they were going to project a hologram in the sky of the Mother Mary to try and fake the second coming of Jesus to the people of Cuba during that entire same time.
Or could it be manipulated purposely by people who have the technology to simulate UFO sightings? And people say, well, of course not. Who would do a thing like that? Well, I would remind you that during the Watergate investigation, it was discovered that there was a plan originated in the White House to surface a submarine off the coast of Cuba and paint the second coming of Christ over the island of Cuba using holograms. Which is well within our technology today. The idea was that since there is a large Catholic population in Cuba, they would be so upset by this vision that this would saturate the communication channels, the telephone system in Cuba, long enough for an invasion to take place.
How interesting. I never heard of that.
Well, I think that's a classic in psychological warfare, but that kind of manipulation is well understood. And I have personally investigated several apparently genuine UFO cases where there was, in fact, a manipulation. My conclusion, the conclusion of scientists working with me, was that there was, in fact, a manipulation taking place, and that it was not a hoax on the part of the witnesses, but a hoax on the part of somebody much better organized.
Colonel John Alexander is really good friends with Hal Puthoff. He was also friends with Michael Aquino and could have been his actual brother-in-law, where his wife was sisters with Michael Aquino's wife. And Michael Aquino was a known Satan worshiper who was accused of several incidents of child abuse, and he wrote the book called Mind Wars, which is an entire military manual on mind control operations. John Alexander was also interviewed on a podcast where he admitted that they did experiments where they made people believe that they were being abducted by aliens and on a UFO when they actually weren't.
Another one we put on a UFO and was able to report like he had been abducted. In this case where he had not been, but UFO sightings were, popular at the time, particularly abduction scenario. So that was one where, again, changing history could cause a new scenario and be able to describe the situation just as if it were real.
Was that an experiment, or was there a practical use for that?
No, that was, I hate to say experiment. A lot of this was, it wasn't consciously what we set up to do. It was more serendipitous. Here's the events. Who are we working with? What can we do? Who wants to, we were literally making it up as we went along.
John Alexander is also really close friends with Chris Bledsoe and even wrote the foreword to his book. If that's not weird enough, Jacques Vallée, who we've already been talking about, who was involved at Stanford Research Institute, friends with Hal Puthoff, developed the internet and ARPANET that later became DARPA. He has pictures of him hanging out at the Church of Satan. If you go all the way back to Andrei Puharich, he was developing and running these space camps for kids, where teenagers would go to these camps for kids, and then he was conducting telepathy and mind control experiments on them. This whole idea of Stranger Things, MKUltra, the Montauk Project, the idea of using kids who have special abilities or telepathic abilities to communicate with UFOs or extraterrestrials and to involve them in unethical experiments in order to do that is all deeply connected to MKUltra. Jeffrey Epstein himself was also abducting and trafficking kids, and it wasn't just about getting their rocks off. He was involved in eugenics, searching for the lost city of Atlantis. And he also said himself that he purchased Zorro Ranch so that he could be close to Sandia Labs and Los Alamos. He was very interested in experimenting on these kids, doing satanic rituals with them, and manipulating all of these scientists through blackmail in order to uncover and figure out all of this weird secret technology. How can you not see that all of this is connected? It's not a distraction. The UFO files, MKUltra, the JFK assassination, the remote viewing program, MJ-12, all of this stuff is interconnected and it all fits together. It is highly likely that as part of the UFO crash recovery program that they're using that information, the reverse engineered technology, and their understanding about the biologics of these interdimensional beings or aliens, how they use telepathy to interface with the craft and the metal of the craft itself, and that they would reverse engineer that and weaponize it not just for anti-gravity and different propulsion, but also for understanding mind control. All of these things have to do with each other. And then just think of how easy it is to run experiments on little kids to try and understand telepathy and how all of this works, to abduct people, to traffic people for satanic rituals, to try and open portals, to communicate with other entities, to open stargates or do whatever they're doing, and mind control. And then while you're doing all of these experiments, how easy is it to just blame it on the aliens? Now, you guys know that I'm someone who's been out, I've seen UFOs, I've done this on my own, I've gone out and connected the phenomena with ancient sacred sites. This is something that I believe is real. But I also think that UFOs and aliens and their abduction stories provide the perfect cover to do a lot of unethical and illegal experiments on kids, possibly even underground cult satanic rituals on them. And then you could blame it all on the UFOs, on the aliens, on the legends of the curse of the skinwalker, and blame it on Native Americans themselves. And then you could do all these experiments, and anytime anybody looked, they would get distracted by the UFO topic, when really it's all one and the same thing and it's connected. So hopefully a lot of this is not scaring you too much or making you too paranoid, but I think it's something that everybody needs to be aware of how all of these puzzle pieces actually fit together. They're not really separate topics from UFOs, MKUltra, and the JFK assassination. Now that you can see the clear picture, you can see a lot of the players involved. It's the same names, the same faces, and the same interconnected history going all the way back to Andrea Puharich and Sid Gottlieb and the MKUltra program, moving from psychedelics into technology and psionics. And it brings us up to now, and why the CIA would go into Tulsi Gabbard's office and try to steal all the CIA files, because what in the world is in there? Now you can see why the Epstein files are so heavily redacted and most of them are missing, why the UFO files haven't all come out yet, what all of that involves and what it's really going to expose, and who are the key players in it. But now that you have a clear picture, you're not sitting there in the dark wondering what's really going on. And you're also just not naively going out and getting involved in the UFO stories, thinking that there's not this whole dark side. It's deeply entangled in child trafficking, satanic rituals, their beliefs and use of esoteric practices and mysticism, and trying to communicate with these interdimensional beings using satanic rituals and child abuse. All of that connects to the Epstein files and what he was all about. It connects to the UFO files and blaming it on UFOs and the technology that they recovered from UFOs and extraterrestrials on how to conduct mind control and telepathy. All of it actually fits together, and it even goes back to the JFK assassination and why the people involved and got blamed for it were probably mind controlled as part of MKUltra, and they were in a team that was formed and hired by Howard Hughes. So now that you know all of this, you can at least have a clear idea and you're not sitting in the dark. And that's all for this video. We'll see you in the next one.